That's fine. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Adam Tooze. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the History Department to a session on an urgent theme. It's an unusual session, gathering I don't think we've ever organised before, which is a meeting of students of the department to discuss a matter of common and urgent interest on the one hand, and on the other hand, the members, at least some of the members of the Board of Visitors, the BOV, which is an extraordinary group of supporters of the History Department who over the years have collectively donated to us and to furthering the research and the activities of the department well over $1 million. And we are profoundly beholden to them for all of the support they give us, and not just financial, but also their intellectual engagement in the activities of the department. It's been a real pleasure getting to know them over the years that I've been at Columbia. Long may that association last, and thank you very much for coming this evening. And I hope that you'll have the chance to meet each other, meet students. The students will have a chance to have some interaction with these generous supporters of everything that we do in the department. So it's a very auspicious occasion on that side. On the other side, of course, we've decided to host a meeting about genocide at the beginning of 2024. And we've obviously done that with intent. There's no coincidence here. It's a topic that we felt we, as historians, had an obligation to discuss, a duty to discuss, also a need, I think. There's a sense in which I find it at least, I'm glad to be here and that we have the chance to do this, and it feels like a real privilege to be able to think out loud and to think with such wonderful colleagues and students and old friends from the BOV about this topic. Because I think we do need to talk about it, and I think not talking and repressing the desire to talk is unhealthy and not worthy of an institution like Columbia. That is not what we're here for. We are in so many different ways connected with the world through background, migration, New York being a great city of migration, through shared culture, but also simply through the life of the mind. And this is one of the irrepressible things about the life of the mind, that it attaches itself almost kind of beyond our control to causes, to issues about which we end up feeling passionately as though they were our families, our life, our kin, our identity. And that creates problems on a campus like this, and it's bound to create problems. And it should very much be part of the role of the campus to work those problems through. There are obviously difficulties doing that at various moments, but surely this is our task. And it's a real privilege to have the chance to do one of those actions of working through and talking through at an occasion like this with such a wonderful group of friends and colleagues. I won't, I think, in present company, sizing up the scene here and knowing so many people here, I don't think we need rules of the road. But I am going to make a suggestion, which is that there is a sense of obviousness about what we're doing, and I suggest that we refuse it and resist it. There are certain things that we could obviously plunge into talking about, and in a sense, I suggest that we don't do that. And what we do instead is engage in a kind of indirect approach, an indirect approach to present-day realities by way of the past and by way of the long traditions of thinking that we've developed about the past, not because they're irrelevant to the immediate present. Many of us here may have opinions about international justice, may have opinions about settler colonialism, how it operates, may have very well-informed opinions about the history of the Middle East. But in a sense, I think we're also on the panel united in the view that to directly approach that, A, brings with it certain risks, and B, also in a sense duplicates what we do every day anyway. And the refreshing thing about a panel like this is that we have other options to exercise our engagement and our thinking. And that's very much the spirit that I would recommend that we proceed in. I know that's in the spirit of the panelists, and I hope I can invite you to do the same. And we really couldn't ask for a better team. Małgorzata Mazurek, to my left here, is one of the world's, if not the world's leading expert in the history of Polish and Central European social science, economics, politics, and law. Precisely in the period that we need to understand for the purposes of our discussion this evening, namely the central period of the 20th century, and an brilliant thinker of the way in which, if you like, local quote-unquote problems in Poland are transposed into general concepts, general challenges to thinking about modernity. And we can't think about genocide without starting in Poland in the 1940s in its modern frame, if that's the way it's framed. So that my far left is my colleague Greg Mann, who's a great specialist in the history of Francophone Africa, West Africa in particular, has worked on the Sahel region, and offers us the chance to break the kind of Eurocentrism and Western centrism of some of our conversations with insights into Africa, which of course has been one of the centers of massacre and of genocide from the 19th century going forward. And then to the right of Greg is Mark Mazower, who has really, I think, two phases of his writing career, looking at your bibliography, Mark, that really engage with this. One, a series of two books dealing with international governance and the ordering of the world and questions of international justice. And then earlier in Mark's career, a series of field-defining studies of the Nazi occupation of Greece, the Dark Continent, the standard textbook for teaching modern European history in the 1990s for many of us. And then a flat-out study of the Nazi Empire, which drew very, very significant comparisons between the Nazi Empire and the Soviet Empire, actually on the territory of Poland as well. It's one of the really fascinating things that book does. As for myself, at an earlier stage of my career, I devoted a lot of time to trying to decipher the economic policies of Nazi Germany, and specifically their relationship to questions of forced labor, Nazi settler colonialism, and racial war in the East. And in that context, I also was an advisor to two German panels that were charged with investigating and coming to terms with the history of the finance ministry and the economics ministry of Germany in the period of the Nazi regime. So at that time, I was what is known as a perpetrator study guy. That's what I did, perpetrator studies. So I think we've really got a variety of different insights here, and I'm looking out here and I see a number of other, I think Vicky de Grazia there, one of the leading specialists on Italian fascism. We have an incredible roster of folks to discuss these issues with, and we're going to start, I think, with Małgorzata, and who's going to give us some essential insights into the original framing, really, of the genocide problematic, which is indeed located in Poland in the 1940s.
Thank you, Adam, for this introduction. Thank you for coming. And indeed, the first few minutes will be like a academic lecture, really, because I have slides just to remind ourselves, what the term genocide means, who invented it, where it was invented, etc., right? So bear with the basics, but I think maybe it was also very informative for me to get these basic facts right and put it on paper. So the term genocide that many have called a crime without a name before it was invented first in 1944, right at the end. Towards the end of World War II, by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer. And the term was first formulated in a book called Axis Rule Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, right? Which was a book encouraged by or sponsored in a way by a Columbia Law School professor, Robert Wilson, and published by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So it has a lot to do with the American rise to global power in the middle of the 20th century. And it was actually a book had 700 pages, and the section on genocide had 16 pages. So it was not the goal of the book, but it was the heart of the book, really, to formulate the definition of genocide. And bear with this schoolish approach, but I will just read it, right? Yeah. So new conceptions require new terms, writes Lemkin. By genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. This new word, coined by the author to denote an old practice in its modern development, is made from the ancient Greek word genos, a race, tribe, and the Latin side, killing, thus corresponding in its formation to such words as tyrannicide, homicide, infanticide, etc., etc. Genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives are disintegration of political and social institutions, of culture, language, something that Lemkin would later stress as cultural genocide, national feelings, religion, and economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, even dignity, and lives of individuals belonging to such groups. Genocide is directed against the national group as an entity, and the actions involved are directed against individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national group, right? Of course, this is the first time when the definition comes up. It's not identical with the Genocide Convention, to be sure, but it's intended, you know, if Lemkin wrote it in the middle of the war, actually having many dreams about his parents, whom he knew were at the time in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, and he was not, he didn't know whether they are even alive. In any case, this was a case study, and Lemkin from the beginning believed that genocide would, the definition that was referring to the Nazi-occupied Europe, was in fact, had in fact a much broader application. I think this is very, very important, right? That more universal outreach was intended from the beginning in Lemkin's thinking. Just to remind you, I mean, I will not bore you with more, you know, slides, but here is the definition that made it actually to the UN genocide convention side in late December 48. What I think is extremely important, and I will really make a few points not to take too much time, is that Lemkin thought about mass atrocities, both, the physical destruction, cultural destruction, and economic destruction of a group, social, religious, ethnic, national, much earlier than when the World War II broke out. And this is something very interesting, that basically the first attempts to formulate what genocide could be were made in the 1930s, and his deep thinking about it started even earlier, when he was a 20-something-year-old young lawyer who just finished studies in Lemberg, Lviv, in today's Ukraine, and came to Warsaw to start his very high-profile career in the Second Republic of Poland, a new country on the map of Europe. So I will just quickly show you where this thinking originated from, and give you a few elements to think with about what I think really, based on actually many biographies of Lemkin, including his own autobiography written by the end of his life, about, you know, what shaped him, right? He came from a Jewish family, quite well off in the, okay, that's the thing that I have never used, in the Volkovsk here. I didn't drink alcohol, it's just really hard to, so it's in the it's in the former, the Pale of, right? It's the Pale of Settlement, Russian Empire, about 100 kilometers east from Białystok, an important Jewish city with also Russian and Polish population, where Esperanto language was born. So basically, Lemkin grew up there in that small town, and near that small town. And, you know, this was a place where, you know, he was a Yiddish speaker, Polish and Russian speaker. He eventually learned 12 languages, and switching languages and speaking many languages, defining himself as Polish, but then Jewish by religion, and then being surrounded by people who didn't even have a fixed ethnic identity, because most of the rural inhabitants around the city, the town of Volkovysk, were people who now can be called Belarusians, but at the time they would be just like Orthodox or Catholic peasants, right? So that's the place where he grew up. So the point number one is that multi-ethnicity, right, was a daily life, and what I think is also interesting is that the way Lemkin thought about groups was not just through the lens of nationality, but also religion, ethnicity, or even political affiliation. Second of all, this is also a place where, you know, mass politics was really on the rise when Lemkin was born in 1900. So nationalism, socialism, communism, all kinds of isms were really being ironed in that seemingly very provincial region. And what I want to say here is that, you know, the status of ethnic groups was in flux when Lemkin was growing up. At the same time, when these nationalisms were on the rise, their very existence could not be taken for granted. The example, if I can say, this is the, you know, that's basically town inhabited by Jews, Poles, some Russians too. So that's maybe this is where I'm heading at. The Pale of Settlement was gone. Actually, during World War I, it was abolished, and then the entire Russian Empire was gone too by the end of World War I. And of course, border wars took time, Soviet-Polish war, but the Lemkin's political homeland was actually a Second Republic of Poland. And what I think is very important is that this was a country with defined by majoritarian nationalism, right? When there was one ethnic majority, actually not so big, less than 70%, and then so-called ethnic minorities or nationalities, Jews, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Germans, etc., etc. I mean, I know that you know it, but just a reminder it is just a reminder that people really, the groupness, or thinking it as Professor Roger Brubaker calls it, groupness, and thinking in terms of collectivity or not just individual, you know, being a single individual citizen, was something that really shaped politics of that country. Why these groups living near Lemkin's home city were under existential danger most of the time, especially because Polish state had also its own denationalization policy, and they also thought that you can denationalize the local population or turn it into Poles, so especially Belarusian peasants, Orthodox rural inhabitants, were slated for colonization, and colonization efforts were well underway in the 1920s and 30s. Military colonial settlers were coming to that region. So Lemkin, who was, was surrounded by these developments, and he was actually in the heart of it. I have, of course, much more to say about it, but another thing that I would like to mention is, apart from multi-ethnicity and groupness, is the sort of inherent internationalism that you basically inhabit as a lawyer working in interwar Poland. Why? Because Lemkin was a secretary of the Committee for, quote, codification of laws of the Republic of Poland, a country that was created out of 3 different parts of empires and dealt with 5 different legal systems. So if Lemkin was a codifier of new Polish law, his work was inherently international because it compared legal regimes from 3 former empires and tried to unify them in the new way. So I would say that even if you were nationalist or anti-nationalist, you were definitely an internationalist if you were an expert working for the Polish state, just by the very fact of being living in a post-partition country. Lemkin was interested in Soviet, Nazi, and German law, etc. And so this is where, in 1933, after Hitler's rise to power, he, for the first time, as a Polish lawyer with international career, he, for the first time, thought about how to define this quote, crime without a name. And the terms that I have no more slides anymore, so just will tell you very quickly, were terms called, one of the terms was barbarism and another vandalism. Barbarism referred to physical destruction of people and mass atrocities. Vandalism referred to what he would later call cultural genocide, the destruction of national heritage or cultural heritage of a given group. And so I think that the fact that, you know, group thinking in terms of ethnicities, nationalities, and other forms of groupness, and this kind of inherent nationalism, as well as you know, the fear of these totalitarian regimes on the horizon, really is the baggage that he took with him, that he took when he left Poland via Lithuania and Sweden to the United States. So the Axis rule in occupying Europe is really the culmination of that thinking. And the one last thing I wanted to say is that when, you know, the efforts of Lemkin, who is described as like the lonely hero, right? A person who, against all odds, made it happen and made the Genocide Convention, made it come true. He always stressed, and I found it very interesting, is that to really generate interest in the Genocide Convention, you have to talk about something more than Nazi atrocities in Europe, that you have to universalize this experience. You have to talk about other examples, remote in time and space, including Assyrian kings, including medieval Mongol conquest of Europe, including indigenous, the conquista, including the erasure of indigenous populations in the Americas, etc., etc. And also a more immediate strategy that he used in the corridors of the United Nations, speaking to people, being a very annoying person, I suppose, was to he quote, "The East would contribute the memories of the suffering, and the West would contribute the feelings of compassion. Together, they would achieve the climate of unanimity." Genocide Convention, in his view, was not just a legal device, but really was a even psychological mechanism, a moral preventive tool that meant to put people to shame, like make them feel ashamed, make them feel sympathy for other people, or on the more basic level, make them conform to rules. And he thought it's as human as to, you know, as human human tendency to destroy, right? So that's where my lessons from, you know,
Thank you.
Studies of Lemkin.
It's really fascinating kind of microcosmic account of the emergence of these ideas. And I think it's particularly interesting to think how right from the very start, the question of context, of comparison, of analogy is brought up, in his case, almost in an instrumental way, so as to attract attention. It's quite difficult for us in retrospect to imagine that you needed extra oomph to make the atrocities of the Nazi regime sell as a story. But in fact, that's actually realistic. In the 40s and 50s, it was not popular to talk about them. Maybe, Mark, you would be willing to like take the story on a little bit from the 40s and talk about the way in which the history of the Holocaust has echoed through the post-war world.
Yes, I was just actually thinking back to the last time I was looking at some of Lemkin's papers and its relevance, I think. So in 1993-94, I was down in the National Humanities Centre, and the war in Bosnia was going on, and I felt quite strongly about it, and I was quite involved in it. And I think as part of that, I got interested in this concept of genocide. And I realized that Lemkin, when he'd come first to the States, had spent some time at Duke. And so I went and did some work in his papers and became interested. But that's only interesting because I'm representative of a sort of paradigm shift that was happening at that time. And that's what I want to convey, I think. What has happened in the historiography to expand the vocabulary of historians over the last 30 years or so. So let me say something about that. And I think the early 90s are an important moment in this. The basic contours of the historiography of the final solution are pretty well known, which is to say, really until the late 60s, early 70s, the idea that historians should spend much time talking about the final solution had not occurred to most historians, and it was not an important part of the historiography of the Second World War. And various things in the 1960s changed that, starting with the Eichmann and the Auschwitz trials, but it was slow. But through the 1970s, interest in the Holocaust accelerated, and I would say by the 1980s there was a rich and vibrant literature in the field, and more than that, the Holocaust had become this kind of trope in the culture that was almost inescapable as a way of thinking about the Second World War. And everybody discussed whether it was unique or not, but certainly the way the historians had approached that, there was a kind of a flavor of the unique case that needed to be explained on the basis of internal factors about thinking about Jews and so on. And then this started to break down in the late 1980s, and it really broke down in the early 1990s, and it broke down in a number of ways. One of the causes was the end of the Cold War and the emergence of independent states in Eastern Europe, who didn't like to be told that the worst thing in history was Nazism, what was so great about communism, and the unification of Germany pushed in the same direction. So suddenly you had the Historienstreit, the battle of the historians in Germany, about whether you shouldn't be able to talk about what had been the great taboo subject for historians, apart from the extreme right until then, which is what had happened to the ethnic Germans of Europe after the Second World War. And you had historians in Eastern Europe saying, shouldn't we be trying to think of a framing in which we can talk about the mass violence of the communist state in the same breath as the mass violence of the Nazi state, and whether or not they're the same thing, we should be able to think about them together and decide ways in which they differ and so on. So the end of the Cold War was already changing the frame. And then came the breakup of Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda. And I'll leave Rwanda to Greg, but the two things were very conjoined in the early 1990s. And we suddenly started seeing mass violence as a product of the modern state as a general category, under which what had happened to the Jews might or might not be in a category of its own, but you needed to be able to consider these things together. And so there is this literature that starts about whether what happened to the Ukrainians in the 1930s under Stalin was a genocide or was not a genocide. You have this whole literature that developed about ethnic cleansing, which as a Balkanist was, for me, a very natural way to think about the 20th century as a whole. And there was this growing realization that you needed to think about a whole geographical zone that extended from the Baltic down to the Eastern Mediterranean as a kind of conflict zone in which empires had broken up, nationalist forces had scrambled for power amid them, and mass violence of different kinds became part of the repertoire of the groups and the states that were struggling with one another to create a new settlement. And that there was a way in which you should see Nazi thinking about the Jews as part of a larger framing of National Socialist thinking about the problems of minorities in Eastern Europe. Not every minority was going to be dealt with in the same way, but unless you saw Generalplan Ost, General Plan East, as the overarching SS plan for Eastern Europe, you were not really going to understand how the Holocaust had happened. And so we started to think about that region as a kind of laboratory for different kinds of state practices. And genocide was a category to think with because it directed your attention to questions of intentionality and to questions of the nature of the state. The Ottoman state in 1915 and the instruments at its disposal is very different from the Third Reich in 1941. And so genocide becomes a way of thinking how important the character of the state and the instruments at the disposal of the state are in these different cases. The whole region was a laboratory for these different kind of episodes of mass violence. But by the same token, the region was a laboratory for international interventions to try to manage conflict. And that went back at least to the crisis of 1878, the Near Eastern crisis of 1878, the great powers getting involved in the Balkans after the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. In the Balkans, forcing freedom of conscience on the Romanians in their constitution, supervising refugee policy internationally at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, I think the first time that that happens. And then, of course, the League drawn in the First World War and after the First World War to try to find an alternative to mass expulsion as a way of regulating relationships within states between minorities and majorities, or in some cases, very faithfully, managing expulsion, as in the case of the Greco-Turkish population exchange. So historians abandoned this idea that you should only just look at the Holocaust on its own terms and started to see it as part of a much larger set of episodes of mass violence. I just want to say something because I think we all want to have a discussion here. I've been thinking about this stuff for a while, and both the Nazi case, the Armenian case, and others, and say something about how these categories operate. I think this is pertinent to where we are now for historians, as opposed to moral philosophers or political scientists. And of course, you can't, sometimes one feels one should be all three, but nevertheless, I think they function in different ways. I remember, for instance, looking into the case of US congressional recognition of the Armenian genocide. And this was a huge issue until it was resolved. And the naive part of me said, well, I don't really understand what's at stake here. Would it be so much better if we just described it as mass murder or massacre? I mean, it's still horrible. It's not more horrible because you call it genocide. But of course, I'm not that naive. I know that there is an added value to calling it genocide. And so I think as a historian, one gets used to thinking about these terms that function in multiple ways. And I try to preserve this distinction in my mind. I honestly do not like the idea that any term is off limit for a historical comparison. If you want to say such and such a regime is apartheid, that's the beginning of your demonstration that it is, and then we can evaluate that demonstration and have an argument. I'm not in the business, and I don't think on the whole historians are comfortable being in the business of outlawing terms. But these same terms have immense political capital. There was no term that had greater political capital by the beginning of the 21st century than the Holocaust. And so everybody else wants to be a genocide too. And so the stakes are very high because now you're in a political confrontation. And so I understand that. That's going to run its course, and the political balance of power will decide where it all ends up. But it seems to me very important to try to preserve an arena for historians to do what they do, because they are in the business of trying to figure out and understand what happened and what the distinctions are. So,
thank you, Mark. I think a sort of a theme that's emerging here is precisely this idea of the historically located effort to find categories. Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
as we are thinking, I love that opening line from Lemkin, like new concepts require new terms and new concepts are spawned by new events. So there's a sort of fluidity here. But I think you're absolutely right. We also have to recognize the investments that are made in fixing things, right? Because those two matter. Certainly at any given moment, one has to understand what those stakes are and the politics around them. Greg, I mean, I know you want to talk to us about two extraordinary examples really over the last 50 years of the way in which that fluidity and efforts at fixing have really played out in two different, completely different arenas in Africa.
Two completely different arenas in that. Yes. So I might have a few maps.
But that's good.
I realized, oh, you know, people need maps, right? Okay, so I was going to talk about two. There we go. Two formative events that took place in Africa. That in some sense and how they offer something in reflecting on the historical roots of the circumstances of the present in terms of debates around the use of the term genocide and its validity and so on and so forth. So the first of these kind of episodes I want to discuss is the civil war in Nigeria, the war in Biafra from 1967 to 1970. And I can't really get into the causes of these things in the small amount of time I have. So unlike an historian, I'm entirely skipping over the causes. Skip that part. Stuff happened. We can talk about it later. We'll never get through. But a civil war broke out in Nigeria. Pogroms, flight of people from the north, in particular to the southeastern region, sometimes referred to as Igbo land, but then kind of reconstructed as the putative or erstwhile Republic of Biafra. And in this civil war, which emerged just after Nigerian independence in 1960, just after the year after the 1960, the federal government of Nigeria, which wanted to hang on to Biafra, pursued a blockade of the territory and essentially used access to food as a weapon in the struggle. And so this is the first kind of chapter of this really happening in post-colonial Africa. It's been practiced elsewhere in Ethiopia, Sudan, so on and so forth. But this was a major moment in which the civilian population of Biafra was cut off from its ports, Port Harcourt in particular, which the federal government had seized, had very little access to imported food and only under the control of the federal government. In a kind of a savvy way, the Biafran government, which was a strange sort of apparatus, but the Biafran government began to cry genocide. We're suffering from genocide. Our people are being killed, you know, en masse and intentionally. And they waged a very kind of modern, very media-oriented campaign to gain support across the world for their cause, and to have the federal government of Nigeria lean back. There were big meetings on campus in what's called Earl Hall. It was an issue in student politics at the time, in the 1960s, not least because there were a number of Igbo and Nigerian, Southeast Nigerian students in American universities, so on and so forth. But the Biafrans very explicitly made reference to what happened in the Holocaust. They said the Igbos and the Jews of Africa. What exactly they meant by that's never been entirely clear to me. But that Biafra was kind of African Auschwitz, right? That there was a campaign of mass killing happening, and the world had to somehow intervene against the federal government of Nigeria. The world is not interested in doing that. Most of the great powers is maybe the wrong term to use, but most of the major nations were lined up behind Nigeria. Biafra had very little support. So in spite of the fact this became a kind of a famous cause, it was not very effective. The political activism was not very effective in the end. Two things that emerged from it, though. One is the kind of a real change in the humanitarian history well, in the history of humanitarianism. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which was very active in Biafra, bringing in food, accused by the federal government of bringing in weapons as well. Unresolved, that question. But the ICRC had always been very quiet, had a very apolitical stance, would not publicly criticize the actors in this conflict. That was not to the liking of the famous French doctors, who then created the Doctors Without Borders organization that we know well. But it's representative. This is the trigger when there's a shift from a very quiet form of humanitarianism, very diplomatic, very sort of gentleman's club in some sense, to a very kind of media-oriented activist form of humanitarianism, which is partly about reporting and witnessing, and sees reporting and witnessing as kind of key to its activities, provoking that kind of sense of the moral need from abroad to engage one way or another. How do we relieve the suffering of the poor Biafrans? How do we, put an end to this mass starvation? This being really one of the first televised famines, maybe the first televised famine, and also very clearly a political famine. In other words, very clearly had political causes. It was not a crop failure, it was not a drought, it was not a natural disaster, it was a military blockade. That was the cause of the famine. There's a short story, there's a long story. Let's go with the short story, right? So, Biafra cannot withstand eventually this blockade, collapses by 1970. But in 1977, in their rewriting of the Geneva Accords, starvation is listed as a war crime. Starvation and the use of food as a weapon of war becomes recognized as a war crime in the wake of the Biafran incident. The other interesting thing about this kind of forgotten chapter is that mortality, and it's grisly to get into numbers, but north of 1 million, maybe as many as 3 million people die in this circumstance. It's a very high number of people. It's largely a forgotten chapter in the kind of sordid history of 20th century genocides. Historians don't usually see it as a genocide. It doesn't quite meet the definitional bar of a genocide, but it is a particularly horrific moment. The Nigerian federal government then adopted a policy they referred to as neither victor nor vanquished, in the sense that there should be a reconciliation of the people. And in fact, the whole point of the war was to reintegrate Biafra, to prevent its secession, and that although property that had been seized would not be returned to its owners and so on and so forth, all kinds of questions were left open by this policy, but the basic policy was, we're not going to talk about this anymore. There are neither winners nor losers. The war has simply ended. So that is a slow and grinding kind of act of political violence, the blockade of food and necessary supplies into the territory occupied by civilian population, quite obviously. What happened in Rwanda in 1994 is obviously a very different story, and many of us will remember this, in one way, or some of us presumably remember Biafra, not me personally. So just to give a sense, I should have showed this map first, actually. I apologize, I missed the map. You can take points off my pedagogy score, but we're talking about kind of Central Africa, right? And particularly about the tiny nation state of Rwanda. In Central Africa, where the question of labeling is really first and foremost. What happened? Was it a genocide? I think there's very little debate this was a genocide. Whose genocide was it and how was it termed is a hot political question. So I had a student come to me after class a couple of years ago who said, "Prof, there's an error on the syllabus. We call it the Rwandan genocide. It's not the Rwandan genocide. It's the Tutsi genocide." The labeling is wrong. You cannot call it Rwandan genocide. The specific victims are the Tutsi, not generally Rwandans. It is not generally a chapter of Rwandan history. It is specifically a chapter in the victimization of the Tutsi. So we had a little back and forth about this. I said, save your question for 3 weeks and we'll get to your question. But the question of labeling, right? What does it mean to call something a genocide? And then who gets to claim the genocide as theirs, the suffering as theirs, right? There was no question in the case of Rwanda that this was a genocide. It was happening on video. It was widely reported. There were witnesses, expert witnesses, and other kinds of witnesses. The body count was growing, very, very rapidly. I mean, this is a traumatic event for many who really witnessed it from quite far away, right? But all the political imperatives abroad, meaning particularly in the West, right, but elsewhere, were not to name it as such, right? Not to name it as a genocide. What Samantha Power refers to, we haven't mentioned Samantha Power yet, but this is about, you know, we've read one thing about the Rwandan genocide, it's probably a chapter in her book. You know, refer to this kind of willful delusion, a nurturing ethical framework for inaction. It's better not to name the thing, because by naming the thing, one would be called upon to act, and therefore there were weeks and weeks of kind of squirming on part of the American government to not name what was happening in Rwanda as a genocide, until finally, you know, this began in the beginning of April. It was identified as what it obviously was by the middle of June, in the middle of June. So what was happening is, again, we can't really get into the causes and the complexities of it. It's, of course, in and of itself, right? Political violence linked to a civil war, an elite project adopted by, you know, the masses of the people, an elite ideological project. One way to think of it is kind of a massive vigilante counterinsurgency campaign, which is maybe a particularly crude way to think about it, but actually fairly apt. And as a chapter, but not the conclusion, neither the introduction nor the conclusion, but a chapter of a racialized politics of power and privilege between a Tutsi minority and a Hutu majority, one seen as alien, the Tutsi, and one seen as indigenous, the Hutu, which is a very important part of the story. The idea that Tutsi were in fact alien to that region, come from elsewhere, they had no real rights. So that the indigeneity of the Hutu was a claim, was a very powerful claim to justify the acts of political violence. It's a deeply colonial history. There are layers and layers and layers of that. How many layers? Well, at least there's a Belgian layer. Before that, there's a German layer. In the post-colonial period, effectively, there's a French layer, although it's never a French colony. And there's the Catholic Church. Thank you very much. So there's a whole set of actors who are producing and reproducing this kind of racialized politics over time. Changes, but it is constantly kind of reinforced as well. What I think is worthwhile thinking of in that, or taking away from that fact, is there are layers and layers of this stuff, and it takes a good deal of intellectual and ideological work to produce mass violence. It's not just a technical work of violence, it's sort of physical work of violence. There's a huge amount of intellectual work that goes into producing it, and to producing not just the category of genocide, right, but also the social category. Rwanda gives us this word of the genocidaire, which is almost, I think it's come into English essentially, right? But to say like people who committed genocide, people who have committed genocide. So how do we go from a noun, somehow skipped over the verb, from genocide to the genocidaire, which doesn't really, you know, do we say genocidaire in English?
Yeah, we do.
In English, yes. So I think that's very important to think about what kind of intellectual, ideological work had to happen to produce such a category of people. And in the case of Rwanda, that's the majority of the population. That's a huge number of people. It's a huge number of perpetrators, right? It's a huge number of victims. It's also a huge number of perpetrators, as Mahmoud Mamdani has pointed out quite eloquently, as is as well. The other thing to think about is not just what kind of, and we don't gesture these things here, but what kind of intellectual, ideological work goes into producing a category of genocidaire, right? But also what kind of intellectual, ideological work goes to us, or we, understanding what it was that happened at the time, in the moment. What did people think was happening? What did people have to think with? What did Warren Christopher and Wright and Bill Clinton and you, those of us who are old enough, have to think with at the time about what was happening? That too is an ideological construct at a certain time. And this is where the Yugoslavia comparison is very important, right? The idea that the Balkans had become this kind of, you know, a scene of bloodletting once again, that particularly as regards to Africa, that there was a terrible youth bulge emerging. This argument that there was what's called coming anarchy was a very popular analysis at the time, circulated very widely in the 1990s. The Clinton White House, Clinton White House sent it to every embassy in the world, apparently. Maybe it's every embassy in Africa. I remember they faxed it because that was the technology at the time, right? They faxed it anyway. That the youth bulge in Africa was going to produce a mass wave of violence in the near future. That came out in, I think, February of 1994. And then the violence begins in April of 94. And people think, boy, is that guy prescient? Right? That's the ideological framework that people had, and it was a very important one. And part of it was to say, these things can happen. On the one hand, post-Cold War, there's going to be a new rules-based order, right? There's an American hegemon. It's the end of history, not the history department, just history. Long live the Board of Visitors, by the way. But there's gonna be this new rules-based order, but then if we identify this thing that is clearly happening as a genocide, if we identify it as a genocide, let me check the rules. There are then actions that we must take. There are consequences politically and otherwise for us in that regard. And so the American government stood back and said, we don't want to see this as genocide. Until the French government did. Now, if you studied African history, little cheat sheet, the French are never the good guys, right? It's the bad hat. So, don't quote me on that. No offense, Connie, no offense. But what happens is the French say, okay, you guys don't want to intervene, meaning everyone else. We will intervene. Everyone else leans back in the Security Council and says, they're up to something. What exactly is it, right? But what would they do is a kind of conjuring, right? You transform a military political catastrophe into a humanitarian catastrophe. And they do that partly by launching what's known as Operation Turquoise, right? Helpfully colored here in the turquoise color. So that you can see that the French deployed a force. They had people in Rwanda, about 1,000 people helping the Rwandan armed forces against the invading Tutsi-led RPF coming from Uganda in 1990, begun the Civil War. In any case, the French come in, they say, we're going to set up this Operation Turquoise. It's going to be a kind of a buffer zone in the west of the country. And that is going to have the effect of putting an end to the advance of the Tutsi army, the RPF, called the Tutsi army, for simplicity's sake, right? And will transform this political and military crisis into a humanitarian crisis. The humanitarian crisis is going to happen a little bit off stage. It's going to happen in what was then Zaire, and then quickly became known as Congo. This is a map from Howard French, our colleague in the journalism school, who was reporting this stuff in the 1990s, quite amazingly. So the French say, we're going to set up this humanitarian corridor. Our gesture is purely humanitarian. And the Americans say, great, now you've made it a humanitarian problem. Now we can intervene and sort of be involved in some way because we can do the work of humanitarians where we could not do the work of, preventing or putting an end to this genocidal process. Okay. I fear I'm going on too long, so I'm going to bring it to a close. I apologize. Let me say three things that come out of this process, and we can leave aside what's still going on in Congo at the moment. Three things. One is, although the term genocide is created in Lemkin, right? What we get in the early 2000s is a recognition, so in the years immediately following, a recognition of a new responsibility to protect that nation states are meant to take on, right? This grows partly, I think, out of things happening around the world in various places. It emerges precisely, and I'm not going to talk about this, but at the moment of the Darfur counterinsurgency or crisis, if you will, in Sudan. But it's also a result of what has happened in Rwanda. This new kind of R2P idea emerges. And the African Union, too, takes on a new position. Having transformed from the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, to the African Union. The African Union takes on a new position at the same time, saying, we will now interfere in places where genocide has happened. We will intervene directly in places where genocide has happened. We will no longer choose respecting state sovereignty over recognizing the needs of civilian populations to be protected against mass political violence. Has that actually happened in practice? Not an example I can think of, but that is the definition that emerges. So these two things emerge at that time, partly as a consequence of this. So the term genocide might not have evolved, other than giving it genocide, but these kind of intellectual legal frameworks have very much changed in the last 20 years or so. The last thing I want to say about this is a little comparison, just as a point of conclusion, is just that it needs a lot of ideological work, intellectual work to reduce the work of genocide, reduce the social category of people willing to commit it. In the case of Biafra, and in the case of Rwanda, in very different ways, but in both cases, the victors, case of Nigeria was the federal government, in the case of Rwanda, it was the victims, arguably, the victims who became the victims, right? The Tutsi army basically prevented genocide. That's what prevented genocide. But in both cases, in Nigeria and Rwanda, there was an awareness of a need to recreate some kind of political community in the wake of genocide, right? That in the wake of this violence, there's going to be some kind of need to occupy that same territory, that those people who were your victims or who were your torturers or executioners were going to be your neighbors. They had been your neighbors before, and they were going to be your neighbors again. And there was a political challenge of how to think about that. right? And I think that's a very profound political challenge. It plays out differently in different places, right? But the end result of genocide historically, at least in these examples, and I think otherwise, right, has not been the fact those people are no longer your neighbors, right? They're just neighbors with a much deeper history. Let me just stop right there. Sorry, I've been going on.
Thank you so much, panel. I'm just going to make an executive decision to extend the running time. We were advertised as finishing at 15:15. I don't think that gives us enough time to go back and forth. So we run on till 20 past, something like that. And I'm just going to, while people collect some thoughts, I'm going to direct a comment and a question to the panel and then go out. I see Jonathan's hand up already. I think the really dramatic point I took away, Greg, from your roundup is, and this isn't really a question, it's just a very sobering realization, is that genocides happen in places like this. Genocides happen in university classrooms. They are cooked up in university classrooms. They are defined in university classrooms. It is an event which at some level is just discursively coded all the way down. And what distinguishes it from earlier generations of massacre, you might say in part, is precisely its ideological quality. Whether or not those are just base ideologies about insiders and outsiders, they are all very elaborate products, essentially, of quite complicated post-19th century ideas about belonging and not belonging. They may feed off all sorts of other dynamics as well, but the modern genocide in the form that Lemkin encounters it, as you described it so beautifully in the colonization policies of the 20s, or as you're describing it, or as Mark and I know from our studies of the inside of the Nazi bureaucracy, it's thought through. And that's, I think, there's a reason why universities care about it. Right? There's a reason why it has the kind of explosive forces it does, because it's the likes of us. If you look at the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen who committed the Holocaust par balle in the Third Reich, so not the camp Holocaust, which only accounted, by the way, for about half, slightly less than half actually, of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. The people who organized that were, the majority of them, PhDs in law and social science. So I think that was one, I think, I'm really eerie the way that it appeared in your account. The question I had, and then I'll start collecting, I'll put the question and then maybe go out and start asking, is how far, one of the really critical issues in thinking about genocide is motive. And certainly with regards to the boundary, and this goes to Mark's essential points about where we place the Holocaust. Arguably the most sensitive boundary in studying the Holocaust is the question of why they did it. And the simple, in a sense, emotionally safe, politically safe place to go is the Germans did it because they're anti-Semites. They hate Jews and wanted to kill Jews. That is the straightforward answer. And it creates around the Holocaust a kind of bubble of self-enclosure. It's because of anti-Semitism and the hatred of Jews, and that has an ancient lineage in Christian civilizations, manifests all over the place at different times. And one of the most controversial things that happens when you start placing the Holocaust, as Mark described it, in relation to other processes of mass killing, is the motives become more diverse. Right? It becomes quite difficult to maintain the idea that the killing of the Jews in its timing, on its scale, and its dynamism as it historically happened was principally simply dictated by that motive. There are moments which clearly do appear like that, like the rounding up of the last Jewish inhabitants of Greek islands in 1944. That seems like an obsessive search. But you look at the large-scale killing of Polish Jews or Belarusian Jews or Ukrainian Jews, and a very different set of motives suddenly appear, become much more salient. And one of them is settler colonial type logics, which Mark alluded to with this idea of the Generalplan Ost, which looks like an unusually carefully and explicitly designed Western European style settler colonial project with entire blueprints. What was designed in university or else just like this. But does go, I think, to another type of genocidal logic, Greg, which you were kind of questioning at the end, which are the transparently economic land grab motivated massive destructions by Anglo colonists in North America and Australia, which do not intend that the victims will ultimately be your neighbors, but actually do end at the total erasure of the indigenous populations, all the better to apply and acquire the resources. So there you have both total annihilation and a transparently economic logic, which is itself then founded in various types of ideology of property and so on that go all the way back to Locke. So for me, you know, these two, I mean, maybe these are just ideas, one segues into the other, is that there is this way in which we can only think genocide, right? Genocide is always a thought thing in various ways. It's always a complex, intellectually articulated thing. And as soon as you start doing that and digging into its logics, one of the things you risk is losing the clarity of your, because a crime motivated by hate is a rather different sort of crime than one that's motivated by a bunch of other types of logic. And it goes to this political valence that labeling has. That was perhaps provocative, but I am keen to bring other people in. Jonathan, your hand went straight up, so I'm gonna bring you in straight away. Other people, gather your thoughts. We'll go back and forth and then go back out.
So I have a question for Professor Mann about Rwanda, but perhaps the other panelists can address the question in your own areas. And it has to do with the reconciliation of and the healing of the genocide. About 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, my wife and son and I went to Rwanda. We were going to trek up in the mountains with the gorillas. But we spent a couple of days in Kigali. And we went to, and I think the name of the museum was even the Rwanda Genocide Museum. I may not be right about that exact name, but that's what it was, a museum memorializing the history of the genocide that you described. I wonder how that fits into this historical pattern, and in particular, the definition of what constitutes a genocide, the healing of it, the reconciliation of it.
Yeah, okay. I don't quite know how to, I mean, I don't know how to respond to the question. It does seem that, you know, one of the, well, let's put it this way. The healing and the reconciliation is also a big ideological project, right? And one of the sort of continuities, one of the remarkable things about Rwanda is the continuity of the Kagame regime over the last, you know, really 25 years or so, right? But he was also the one leading these forces in the 1990s. So, you know, to say that what was the social logic of the pre-colonial kingdom, and was the social logic reinforced and transformed in various ways across, you know, decades of colonial trusteeship rule and so on and so forth, right? Will no longer be the social logic is a pretty strong ideological commitment to maintain. Had there been a change in regime over time, perhaps that commitment would have wavered or shifted in different ways, right? But the kind of continuity of that post-genocidal form of government that is able to kind of deliver materially and economically while leaving very little space for kind of civil debate, I think is a formula that has met with maybe some success, right? At least if you measure success as longevity and power, but has tried to snuff out the question, or at least the reproduction of those questions about who's who and what's what.
No.
If I could say two things, I think it is a very important question. Yugoslavia after the Second World War is a very interesting case, if one's thinking about reconciliation, because in effect what you had, even apart from the Germans, was a Serb-Croat. I don't really want to call it civil war because the Ustashi were much more powerful, but massive violence that then became one of the chief challenges facing the Tito regime. And I think what's interesting about your point is that the establishment of the Tito's regime is not often conceptualized in terms of a regime that required an ideology of reconciliation, but it absolutely did, and that's a very interesting way to look at it. I wanted just to say something, Adam, about the point you realized, which is, you know, why they did it, motive. And my thought, you know, every question should be answered with a question. Why they did what? Let's take the Nazis as the emblematic case. I don't know that the Nazi leadership had given the slightest attention in the spring or summer of 1939 to what they were going to do with 2.5 million Jews in Poland when they invaded Poland. So the idea that there was this kind of, I mean, we now know all this, right? The idea, and actually they didn't have much clearer idea in the summer of 1940. So you say to yourself, well, okay, if that's really true, then how come they end up doing all of these things? And I think the short answer to that is war, that it's war that changes the horizon of possibility. And that you can't and one of the things we've learned from the historiography is that the war as a context that changes the way. So yes, there are intellectual traditions, there are producers of ideas, but the war is the producer of ideas that enables visions of to escalate in ways that were simply not conceivable. And I think one of the reasons why much of the industrial aspect of the final solution is kept secret is precisely it's a recognition of the gap that exists between what the leadership has realized is possible and what they think a large part of the population is able to imagine. And that gap has to be bridged over time. Universities haven't just generated all these Germans thinking genocidal thoughts, I think.
I mean, but I totally take your point. The consequence of that is, though, that the kind of closure and solidity of the Holocaust as a closed and well-defined entity just disintegrates even more. Because then you end up asking the question, what does it mean to find the love?
You could go even further if you wanted to, and I never quite dared explore this argument in print. You have three things, and I'm not sure how they are connected.
Yes.
You have the mass killing of the Einsatzgruppen
Yeah.
at the time of the invasion of the Soviet Union. That's the first major killing of Jews. You have the industrially equipped camps of Poland for Operation Reinhardt of 40, mostly late 41. That's the second. And then you have Auschwitz hoovering up by then, yes, by halfway through the life of Auschwitz, probably there is something that you could call the final solution in the way that we understand it. But I'm not sure that much until that point, many people in the German elite were thinking in the joined up way that nobody makes that argument. But if you look at the logic of the events, I think you're absolutely right. The thing
that comes pretty close now. I mean, in the sense, and to radicalize that, if you stop the clock in early 1942, the largest act of racially motivated killing is not against the Jews, but against Soviet prisoners of war who've been starved to death in their millions by December 42, right? So it's not even obvious that the scale of escalation is driven principally by the Judeo-side. It's quite clear that by 44, in a sense, it's acquired a coherence, which is then dramatic. But that is exactly what I wanted to get to. I think if you start, and along the way, the motives vary. Right? Along the way, the motives vary, and the fascinating, horrifying thing about the Holocaust, I think this is what one has to credit, is the sort of entrepreneurial activity of key actors in the system in tying them back together. I mean, that's what the Wannsee Conference was in 42, was actually an effort to actually do joined up government on the Jewish question and to actually explain amongst the bureaucrats what was going on. It wasn't a well-designed blueprint in advance, it was the rolling out of an effort to bring coherence.
Yeah, I would add here, before you ask your question, two things. First of all, is that when the people who are inside hell, right, try to read also, they read Nazi decrees just like Lemkin read somewhere in, Durham and at the Duke University. At the same time, people were trying to understand what was happening on the ground as it happened. And I think, just a correction is that, people were reading Mein Kampf, especially Jews in Eastern Europe, were reading Mein Kampf very carefully since it was published in 24. So they at least their anxious part of self was fearing the worst for sure. But if you look at, I study Polish economists, one of them was in Warsaw during the Nazi occupation, and he writes a piece called about the material conditions of Nazi occupation that actually talk about how Nazi occupation deprived Jews of right to live. And I think that realizing that you have no more right to live is targeted against group as a whole, right? And it of course, Nazi occupation is haphazard, and your and Mark Mazower's book show it brilliantly. But I think there are moments that you can identify you know, through the history, like intellectual history of people who lived in, you know, in the Nazi Europe, right? That they were guessing intentions based on historical evidence, right? Doing intellectual work, basically. Another aspect I would like to add is that, you know, there is a shift also in historiography as how to study genocide, right? And I think it's the very fact that you didn't actually talk about it as, you know, for in the 50s, 60s, 70s, right, and 80s is something that Mark Mazower already mentioned. But when historians started to go back to the problem of mass violence, they realized, especially in the late 1990s, people like Jan Tomasz Gross and Omar Bartow, I'm just speaking about my field, is that you need to study history locally in order to understand the anatomy of genocide, to cite the title of Omar Bartow's book. And it also adds new intentions, new motives. It helps understand motives of genocide in a new way, because it's really, as Greg Mann said, it's about neighbors killing their neighbors. And the perpetrators are somewhere in Berlin, but they are also on the ground in next door house, right? And so I think it adds a lot of nuance and a new universe of motives to the understanding of genocide. And this is really early 2000s.
Yeah, I would argue, I'd say there were three moves, right? There was a move towards a refinement of the perpetrator studies, which was what Mark and I maybe came out of, certainly I did in the 90s. There was a huge resurgence, and I'll never personally forget the encounter with it coming to the United States, of victim-based studies, right? Saul Friedlander, the video archives, the Fortunoff archive of the survivors, huge, for instance, at Yale, and quite absent in Europe, especially in the German Academy, for obvious reasons, because there are no survivors to speak to. It's not a large, as it was at the time, certainly not a large Jewish community, and the moral responsibility was to do perpetrator studies. And then the third element, exactly as you say, if you like, community-based kind of ecological accounts of violence, which were very prominent in the Polish case, where the question of collaboration or the question of deep-seated anti-Semitism is hugely explosive in political terms. It has to be processed. And I think a kind of a complete accounting presumably involves all three perspectives, and maybe the fourth, which would be Greg's kind of the external view of international actors who are watching this from the outside. We've got a question there, though.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in Jewish genocide is one of the genocides I know of, and it's like two different names, right? Because we call it the Holocaust, the Jewish genocide, and then I'm not French, we call it the Shoah.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, because I'm guessing that ultimately, like, genocides have a real meaning, because genocide is quite legalese, but the fact that it's so universally.
Could you speak up?
Oh, sorry. I guess, like, the fact that you use Holocaust and Shoah to talk about the Jewish genocide, and you don't use more local names to talk about other genocides, I'm wondering if that means, like, a greater recognition of it, or maybe pay more attention to the victims in a way. Like, I wonder what your thoughts are about this, like, very peculiar.
This is a great question. Can I collect another one? Do we have another question? Oh, yes.
I just have a question about everyone seems to have spoken a lot about the distinction of genocides being neighbors killing neighbors. And I just wonder about the importance of that distinction and why you're not seeing it more as a government or a system or a group of extremists killing neighbors. Because I look at Rwanda and I don't see Rwandans killing Rwandans. I see a group of extremists. I see 200,000, a small percentage, honestly, being able to carry out a huge thing, and maybe a little bit of fear and apathy allowing the rest of it to happen. It's the same in Germany. I think all of us would be maybe a little wary of saying Germans did this, and more willing to recognize that we ourselves could participate in this in a way that they did by being afraid to act.
I think that's a great question, the proportion actually of killers and the people that are involved, and how that works, how that's situated. Do we have another one? So we have the question of terminology, and yeah.
I guess just thinking of these two questions, I was thinking you guys were talking a lot about nationalism and kind of like the project of, basically, I don't know that much about the Biafran War, but basically like Nigeria trying to, stabilize itself after independence, or Rwanda, the world is changing, there's a new response to these conditions and so on and so forth. And thinking of the, conflicts that happened in the Cold War, I was thinking of the example of Indonesia, where, 1 million people were killed, not because they were Tutsi or Jewish, but because they were members of the Communist Party. And you have like these examples where it's a clear kind of targeted act of mass violence, but we live in a different world from the 40s and the 30s. And I was wondering, I don't know, you were talking about Lemkin. Are we at a point where we're gonna kind of shift the concept and think about it in a new way? Because it's not more a conflict of like national construction, or it's like more colonial, or I don't know even what I guess after the end of history or whatever that we're in. So I was kind of thinking also kind of in that vein, what do you guys think about this?
Excellent.
We'll jump into it directly into that.
Let's do this as our final round
Before
of
I-
questions, because I see the clock. So
Before I forget, so
yeah.
actually it's worth going back to Lemkin to answer your
Yeah.
question. Why? Because he wanted to include political actors in the definition. And at the time, the people who opposed, when he was trying to push for the Genocide Convention, were the people who opposed it among others. There were the British were against, etc. But also the Soviets didn't want to have a political group as a category, because they feared that they would be made accountable. So it's a very different. But but for that veto, a political group might have, it's possible that it would have made it to the definition of the genocide. So I would say, of course, the genocide concept is evolving, and you cannot stay, it doesn't make sense to stay to some kind of antiquarian definition, but actually it's interesting that the political groups were part of it. And it's also, there's a Lemkin turn in Ukrainian studies. It's people really thinking hard about how, Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, is also part of the genocide, one of the genocides, right? And it helps them to think about in terms of groups.
Greg, maybe you can come back on the issue of how we actually should understand the logic of perpetrators and victims in the Rwandan case.
Well, that in some sense is a whole lecture, right? Because there's chapter 2, there's this sort of the second wave, if you will, I don't know what you want to call it, the Congolese sequel, right? But without getting into that, but just to say what happens in Rwanda itself, and then kind of in that 94, 95 kind of period, right? You actually have a huge number of perpetrators. You have very few beneficiaries, right? This is a useful distinction that Mark Mazower makes. You have a highly localized, very direct, face-to-face form of mass killing, which is quite different than, by and large, what happened in the context of the final solution and so on and so forth. And that has been one of the things that historians have really struggled, others have struggled to, explain and think about. I will say that, of course, the flip side of that is true, right? The flip side is you have neighbors killing neighbors, right?
Mm.
You have neighbors saving neighbors, right? We need a word for neighbors killing neighbors en masse, right? We need a word for that. We had to make a new word. You're talking to Lemkin, had to make a word for this, right? That's genocide. Do we need a new word to say? What is neighbors saving neighbors? What is the phenomenon of someone protecting the people around? Do we need a word for that? We already have, what is the word humanity? We already have that word, right? We're talking about specific new neologism that we need in that moment of the post Second World War moment, right? But we know what the word is for recognizing humanity in the other. We have that word already.
Oh, do you want to come in on this question?
Just a couple of things I think you're right. One of the things that happened about 1992 was everybody discovered ethnic conflict. And everybody forgot about class conflict because the Cold War was over. And so the Ukrainians came along and said, look, the Holodomor is a genocide. Because Stalin was targeting the Ukrainians, and the Soviet historian said, no, it was a class war. And there seemed to be a lot at stake, and I suppose what was at stake ultimately was ideological motive. about whether you thought the Soviet regime was motivated by nationality in that way. They had nationality policy for sure. Same thing in Kazakhstan with the Kazakh family. So we know a lot more now about those cases than we knew then. But genocide prompted the query, I think. And on the question of the name, you know, history is all about names, as we've been, I mean, genocide is a name. And so there are competing impulses and competing logics here. You want your suffering to be recognized. So imposing upon the world a name that nobody understands is not going to help at a certain point, but it may be possible later, right? On the other hand, do you want your suffering to be known by the name given to it by the perpetrators? So I think you see this playing out in different ways in different episodes of this kind. And I would say, not really having thought about it systematically before, you need what happened to your people to achieve a certain public salience before you can get into the business of saying, no, that's not what it's called this. Because people won't take any notice, for one thing. And secondly, of course, it may be wrong to think about singular names. I mean, we touched on this with the fund. It may be wrong to think about singular names anyway, because viewed locally, when these things were happening, they may not have had the sense at that moment of being part of some grand cosmic event. So they may have called it something else entirely. And I think it's an interesting question.
There's an extraordinary passage in Saul Friedlander's the second volume, the final volume of this epic history of the Holocaust, which is, I think, one of the most successful efforts to bring the perspective of perpetrators and victims together, in which he describes this experience, Mark, that you're capturing there of the Holocaust for so many of its victims, of floating backwards towards a waterfall. And you can feel the pull and you can hear the rumbling of the waterfall, and you know possibly there's something terrible behind you, but you can't see it until you're swept over and then you're dead. And it's this experience of sliding towards catastrophe for the victims as well. Many were filled, as you were saying, Małgorzata, I thought that was very affecting, by all sorts of anticipations and fear, and there are rumors, and there are extraordinarily brave people who are trying to pass messages out and say, no, take it seriously, it's for real, you know, it's the end, and you must act accordingly. And yet it's so difficult to let go of the assumptions of ordinary life and the continuities of ordinary life. You kind of have to be mad to believe it's real after all. Right? You genuinely have, in some senses, to end up sharing the perverted logic of the perpetrators to believe and then act on the belief that it is real. And I thought that image in Friedlander of this, if you've ever been around the big waterfall, you know what I mean, like it's just this thunder, you know there's something there, but you don't see it until it swallows you up. Thank you very much for coming this evening and attending and contributing in such a great way to a really memorable occasion. It's really great. And we should do more of this kind of thing.
We're going to stay around.
Please, yes, join us for a small reception outside.